Hi, I'm the son of a powerful man, but I was never part of his family. The day I got hired at his company, I thought I'd finally earned a place at the table. I was proud. I was loyal. But as I walked out of that glass tower on my first day, an old man stopped me, ragged, starving, and he said, "Buy this icon, then quit that job tomorrow." I laughed then, but I'm not laughing now, because what followed wasn't just betrayal. It was a slow, deliberate erasure. They rewrote the truth. My own father signed off on it. They tried to make me disappear with a smile. You ever wonder what it feels like to be framed by your own blood? To realize family doesn't protect you. It prepares you to fall? And that old man? He knew something. But before I quit, he said there was one thing I had to do. What do you think it was? The revolving glass doors shut behind me with a soft hiss, and for a second, the noise of the city felt like a wave rushing up to greet me. Distant sirens, the hum of traffic, a burst of laughter from a group across the street. I stood still, briefcase in hand, staring at the reflection of the building behind me. My father's building. Not mine, not yet. There was no celebration waiting outside, no one to call, no photo to snap and share. Just me and the weight of a job I hadn't asked for, but knew I had to accept. A job that looked like redemption on paper, but felt more like probation. They didn't smile when they offered it, didn't say, "We're glad to have you back." It came as a memo, a signature, a meeting that started 10 minutes late and ended 5 minutes early. Still, I showed up, shirt pressed, words measured, eyes down. Because in my family, happiness comes with a price, and gratitude is a currency that's never accepted at face value. I adjusted my collar and glanced down the street, watching as the late autumn light stretched long across the pavement. The sidewalks were already littered with crisp early leaves, making a rustling sound when people passed. My father's company sat like a silent empire in the middle of a mid-sized city that ran on ambition and closed-door meetings. It had taken nearly 7 years for me to be allowed back in. 7 years of silence, distance, and the kind of absence you don't dare ask about. But I was back. And that was supposed to mean something. Not for the money, not even for the title. Just recognition. Just one damn nod that said, "You're not invisible anymore." I wasn't holding my breath for that nod. Not after the way things went down last time. This offer was more like a leash than a handshake, and I wasn't naive enough to pretend otherwise. I stepped off the last marble step and onto the sidewalk when I saw him. The old man was sitting near the curb, knees drawn up, a tattered coat wrapped around his frame. He wasn't shaking a cup or shouting for change. He didn't even look up at most of the people who passed, but in his hand, resting gently on his knee, was a small religious icon, wooden, worn, with a faded image I couldn't quite make out from where I stood. When our eyes met, he offered a small nod. Not pitiful, not desperate. Just a quiet, steady look, like someone who had long made peace with being overlooked. "Son," he said, barely above a whisper, "would you buy this? At least I'll be able to eat today." There was no act in his voice, just fatigue. I hesitated, not because I didn't believe him, but because something about his presence felt familiar, not in face, but in restraint. In how he asked like he already knew the answer would be no. "I don't need the icon," I said, "but I'll get you something to eat." He didn't protest, just nodded again, softer this time. I crossed the street, grabbed a sandwich and a bottle of water from a corner store, and brought it back to him. I could have walked away after that. Most people would have, but something held me there. Maybe it was the way he waited to open the food until I sat down on the curb beside him. He ate slowly, like he was rationing the moment. "I used to be someone too," he said quietly. "Now I'm no one, and it doesn't even hurt anymore." I didn't know what to say to that. I just nodded. It wasn't pity I felt. It was recognition, like looking into a mirror that aged without you. When he finished, he folded the paper wrapper neatly and tucked it into a pocket. I stood to go, brushing the dust from my slacks. That's when it happened. His hand shot out, not aggressively, but fast enough to surprise me, and gripped my wrist. Stronger than I expected. I turned back, startled. His eyes locked onto mine, and he leaned in, voice low, almost inaudible beneath the noise of the street. "Tomorrow," he said, "you should quit that job." I blinked. "What?" "But before you do," he added, "there is something you must do." His grip loosened. For a second, I couldn't move. Couldn't even process the words. He wasn't threatening. He wasn't deranged. But he spoke like someone who knew more than he should. I didn't ask for details. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction. I just nodded once and stepped back. As I walked away, my mind spun in quiet circles. The logical part dismissed it. An old man. A strange moment. Nothing more. But something in me filed it away like a note you don't know why you're keeping. Because warnings don't always come with thunder. And sometimes the quiet ones are the ones you should listen to most. Back at the parking garage, I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine. I looked up at the towering building once more. I just got back in. Walking away now would look ungrateful, paranoid, weak. But some part of me, small and stubborn, already knew. This job wasn't a beginning. It was bait. I woke up the next morning realizing the question wasn't whether the old man was right. It was how much damage had already been done. It was still dark outside when I got dressed. I chose a gray shirt, not too crisp, not too relaxed, no tie. I wasn't trying to stand out. I wasn't trying to disappear either. Just enough to pass through unnoticed. Downtown was still half asleep when I parked a few blocks away from the office. I wanted the walk. Wanted a few minutes of concrete beneath my feet. Something solid before I stepped back into whatever theater awaited me upstairs. At corporate headquarters, I headed straight to the executive floor. I'd heard through one of the assistants that a meeting was happening. First internal strategy alignment, she called it. But I hadn't received an official invite. No agenda. No briefing. I arrived 10 minutes early. The room was as I remembered it. Long, polished table, too much glass, not enough warmth. Leather chairs arranged in a circle of power. Familiar faces trickled in, one by one. Some glanced at me, then quickly looked away. Others didn't bother. Conversation started, then stopped as I approached. I took a seat at the far edge of the table. That's when I noticed it. Every chair had a white name card neatly printed in bold font, except mine. No one said anything. No one asked me to move, but no one acknowledged I was there, either. I sat with my hands folded, watching a man across from me adjust his cufflinks like the room belonged to him. It didn't sting yet. Not then. Not in the way it would. When the meeting started, my father walked in last. He nodded to the man beside him. That man, Harold, began the agenda. It was dry at first. Revenue forecasts, regional shifts. Then came a data report. I recognized it immediately. It was mine. Hours of work, analysis I'd prepared 2 weeks ago, graphs I'd designed, conclusions I'd drawn. But when it was presented, Harold said, "Our analytics team has done a solid job preparing this. We'll move forward based on these recommendations." No one looked my way. There was no my son, no David put this together. Just a nod from my father and a few grunts of approval. I waited for someone to correct it. Someone to mention my name. No one did. I was sitting in the room. I was breathing in the same air. But in their eyes, I wasn't real. Just a shadow, filling space without shape. At some point, someone said, "Let's make sure the team knows this direction is final." The team. A vague body. An invisible hand. I clenched my jaw, kept my eyes on the table, and told myself, "This is fine. You're new again. They're testing you. Be patient." But the truth landed harder than I expected. I was useful, but disposable. I was seen, but never really. I debated speaking up. Just a word, a correction, maybe a casual, "Glad to see the reports being used," but I didn't. Not out of fear. Or maybe it was. Maybe it was fear in a suit and tie, dressed up as strategy. I told myself it was patience. Looking back, it was training. The meeting dragged on. More approvals, more direction setting. My work passed around like water in a room that pretended I wasn't thirsty. As it wrapped up, people began standing, checking watches, muttering about back-to-backs and emails. I reached into my pocket to pull out my phone, and felt it. The icon. I had shoved it there the night before, after meeting the old man. I hadn't thought about it again until that second. I didn't take it out. Just let my fingers brush against the worn edges. I remembered his whisper. I remembered the certainty in his voice. And for the first time, I didn't brush it off. On the way out of the room, I lingered near the door, waiting for the hallway to clear. That's when I heard it. Two executives, voices low. "Yeah, well, he's temporary. Everyone knows that." A pause, the kind that carries weight. "Didn't you hear? This isn't permanent, just optics." My name wasn't said, but I didn't need it to be. I stood there for a moment longer, frozen in a corridor lined with glass and silence. They weren't testing me. They were placing me. Being positioned only matters if you know what you're being set up for. I stayed late that evening under the excuse of finishing a report no one had officially asked me to complete. It was a familiar tactic in that building. People respected presence more than progress. If they saw your light on after hours, they assumed commitment or desperation, sometimes both. The floor emptied in stages. First the assistants, heels clicking away in pairs. Then the mid-level managers, voices fading as they debated dinner plans. Finally, the senior people drifted out, coats over arms, conversations hushed and selective. By the time the elevators stopped chiming, the office felt hollow, like a theater after the audience has gone home. I wasn't hunting for proof. I told myself that more than once as I logged back into my workstation. What I wanted was clarity. A reason for the missing name card. An explanation for the way my work had floated through the room without ever touching me. If there was nothing to hide, I would find nothing. That was the rule I set for myself. It felt reasonable, responsible. The shared drive loaded slowly, folders blooming open like file cabinets no one had dusted in years. I noticed I still had access to an internal archive section, not because anyone had granted it, because no one had bothered to revoke it. Oversight was common when people assumed you didn't matter. Inside were meeting notes, draft decks, version histories stacked like sediment, email threads marked internal only. I clicked at random, then more deliberately. Dates caught my attention first. Several files predated my hiring by months. I leaned back in my chair, the hum of the building settling into a low, constant tone. This wasn't new activity. This was preparation. One folder stood out. The name was bland enough to avoid notice. Risk Mitigation, Q4. I hesitated, then opened it. The documents inside were concise, clinical, written by people who spoke in contingencies and outcomes. I scanned down the page and stopped. My name appeared once, not in a greeting, not as a contributor. It sat beside a designation I'd never seen attached to a person before. Operational buffer. I didn't reread it. I didn't need to. The meaning landed all at once, clean and sharp. I hadn't been hired for growth, or trust, or reconciliation. I had been hired to absorb impact. The room felt smaller, not because of panic, but because the architecture of it all suddenly made sense. The vague job description, the silence, the way my father never met my eyes in that meeting. It wasn't neglect. It was design. This wasn't a misunderstanding, I thought. It was architecture. Memories rearranged themselves without asking permission. The seat without a name wasn't an oversight. It was rehearsal. The way my work had been praised without attribution wasn't carelessness. It was practice. The pain wasn't that they didn't trust me. It was that they never intended to. I sat there as the lights dimmed automatically, one row at a time, until only the glow of my monitor remained. I didn't feel anger. Not yet. I felt something colder. Confirmation has a way of stripping emotion down to its bones. I thought of the old man again. The steadiness in his voice. The precision of his warning. It didn't feel strange anymore. It felt timely. I closed the folder. I didn't download anything. I didn't forward files to myself. I didn't confront anyone in the hallway or fire off a late-night email. Acting now would expose me. Waiting would expose them. Silence had protected them. Now it would protect me. I shut down my computer, gathered my things, and walked out into a building that no longer felt like a place of opportunity. It felt like a stage, and I had finally seen the script. I didn't know how they planned to use me yet, only that the moment was coming. The moment came sooner than I expected, and it didn't arrive quietly. 2 days had passed since I found the document. I hadn't spoken to anyone about it. I hadn't changed my behavior, but I'd felt the shift around me, subtle at first. Then, late morning, my office phone rang. Short tone, no caller ID. Executive corridor, 10 minutes. That was all. No calendar invite, no subject line, no HR rep waiting outside the door to soften the blow. Just a hallway I hadn't been called into since my first day. It was quiet up there, like a different company entirely. Thicker carpets, warmer lights, thinner patience. I adjusted my collar before stepping off the elevator. The walk to my father's office was slow, deliberate. I passed 2 senior VPs on the way. Neither made eye contact. The door was already open when I arrived. They were waiting. My father sat centered behind the desk, flanked by 2 executives I recognized from past quarterly briefings. Neither had ever spoken to me directly. One of them gestured, "Come in, shut the door." It clicked behind me with a sound too soft for its weight. They didn't ask me to sit, but I did. Centered, calm. They started with the usual nonsense. Corporate abstraction dressed as concern. "We've been reviewing structural alignment," one said. My father nodded, arms crossed. "There's been chatter about exposure," said the other. "We're thinking of a temporary reassignment to stabilize perception." No one said blame containment, but that's what they meant. They were placing me closer to the blast zone, positioning me to absorb what they couldn't afford to carry themselves. I didn't interrupt. I didn't nod. When they paused, I responded with the same restraint they'd used. What are the metrics for stability you're aiming for? That caught them. Slight hesitation, small twitch near the eye of the man on the left. And the timeline of reassignment, I added. Is it performance-linked or appearance-driven? They didn't answer directly. They weren't used to me asking real questions. I had always been the quiet son, the agreeable placeholder, until now. Then my father spoke, not loudly, not with anger. His tone was flat, as if narrating a board presentation. "You've been given opportunities not everyone gets," he said, eyes not leaving the window behind me. "How you carry yourself will determine what comes next." He didn't need to say more. The room heard the rest. Cooperate, and you'll be remembered. Resist, and you'll be rewritten. He didn't threaten me. He didn't have to. The most effective threats live in silence, where you imagine their reach. I let it hang there a moment. Then I did something that shifted the air in the room. I didn't protest. I didn't bargain. I looked directly at my father and said, "If something goes wrong, I won't accept responsibility for decisions I didn't make." No edge, no tremor, just clarity. They didn't expect that, especially not from me. I watched the three of them process it. A moment of silence, not out of respect, but calculation. They'd been counting on compliance, not confrontation. Eventually, one of the executives cleared his throat, muttered something about a transition plan, and stood. The meeting was over, apparently. I walked out without waiting to be dismissed. Back in the elevator, descending floor by floor, the adrenaline hit me in reverse. My chest stayed still, but my mind began charting out the damage. I'd spoken a line I couldn't take back. I had marked myself. Visible now in ways that didn't go unnoticed in this place. There was no going back to invisibility. I stepped off on my floor, past two colleagues in the hallway. One glanced at me, opened his mouth slightly, then looked away. It didn't take long to see what came next. By lunch, 3 emails I normally received were missing. Meeting invites vanished from my calendar. Access to a project folder returned an error message. No official word. No confrontation. Just quiet, methodical disassembly. They weren't trying to correct me. They were trying to contain me. And yet, I felt no regret. The cost was real, but it wasn't fear I felt. It was recognition. I had seen the shape of the storm early. All I'd done was speak it out loud. Warnings aren't meant to stop storms. They're meant to prove you saw them coming. By the end of the day, I was working from a different computer terminal, one that didn't have my files anymore. I didn't ask why. They knew I knew. And that silence between us was a language of its own. Still, they'd missed something. A miscalculation. They believed my warning was resistance, but it wasn't. It was data. And if they'd heard it correctly, they'd have known I hadn't fired the first shot. I'd only shown them where they were standing. They ignored the warning. And that told me exactly how far they were willing to go. Because now I needed to see just how far they were willing to go, I kept my head down that week and focused on the work I could still access. I had grown accustomed to the quiet shifts, like curtains barely stirring in a draft. But that afternoon, the pattern solidified into something unmistakable. I noticed it first at the weekly operations briefing. The agenda had been circulated without me, not accidentally omitted, a deliberate reshuffle. I showed up early, cup of coffee in hand, hoping someone would say, "Glad you made it." Instead, Half the group didn't look up, and the other half glanced briefly before turning back to their laptops. Decisions were made before I even sat down. Vendor contracts renewed, staffing adjustments approved, and a cost analysis ratified. All without a word to me. I wasn't asked for input, nor was I acknowledged for prior contributions. It was as if I were a chair in the room, visible but vacant of influence. After the meeting, a manager approached me by the elevator with a thin smile. "Just streamlining workflows," he said, as though that explained everything. "You'll see what I mean next week." He didn't look me in the eye. I nodded outwardly, but inwardly, something coiled tighter. It wasn't noise. It was the absence of noise that hurt the most. Later, in the ops floor that hummed with efficiency and fluorescent lights, whispers of a recent project review reached me. Not through a meeting invite, not in a conversation directed my way, but in an exchange between two department heads, voices low enough to seem casual. "Yeah, the compliance miss could be bigger," one said. "Well, it landed on him," the other replied. "Nobody really noticed until it was on the radar." They assumed I knew nothing. They assumed I was blissfully unaware. And in that moment, I realized what they were doing. No one was accusing me outright. They were letting silence be the weapon. By not speaking my name, not defending my work, not assigning clear responsibility, they were redirecting the narrative. They were creating plausible deniability and allowing collective memory to rewrite itself. Reports I authored were referenced indirectly. Messages about ownership were vague. My presence was like a ghost at a banquet, seen but not served. They weren't attacking me, I murmured to myself as I slid into my car after work. They were letting me disappear. That realization pressed hard, not like a blow, but like cold water drawn slowly around my ribs. And yet, in that pressure, something like self-doubt crept in. Was silence really the answer? Should I have pushed harder earlier? Was coming back here the right choice? Questions like that twisted in my chest that evening as I pulled out of the parking garage, the sun having just dipped below the city skyline. Streetlights flickered on, and for a moment, the world felt too quiet. I thought about walking away, just handing in my badge, collecting whatever dignity I had left, and disappearing into a quieter life. Somewhere I wasn't constantly under scrutiny. Not because I feared the situation, but because it was exhausting at a level I hadn't anticipated. Not weakness, just the ache of a spirit worn thin. But as I turned onto the main boulevard, my phone buzzed. An email from a junior colleague who rarely reached out directly. I glanced at the message as the light turned green and nearly missed the turn. It read, "Hey, I thought you might know who to talk to about this task. I got tagged for something that wasn't even in my queue, and now it's flagged as my deliverable." I recognized the pattern instantly. Different face, same strategy. There was a moment of stillness inside me, a brief pause where I just breathed and let the engine idle. I could have skipped the email, pretended I didn't see it, walked away and let them figure it out for themselves. It would have been easy, quiet, obvious. But I didn't. I called the junior employee and arranged a quick face-to-face in the lobby of the building. We sat on the worn leather sofa near the entrance, the hum of morning commuters and exhausted executives fading around us. They showed me the emails. Not once was the task formally assigned. Yet when the system flagged it, blame was attached. That was the moment it crystallized for me. This wasn't just about me. It was a pattern of erasure. I helped unpack the thread. I made notes, documented timestamps, and clarified who was responsible for what. Not to expose anyone, not to create a spectacle, but to protect someone who deserved a chance to be seen, unlike me. Because if I stayed silent now, I wouldn't just be protecting them, I'd be teaching them how to disappear. We left the lobby with a plan, simple steps to correct the assignment and restore clarity. No dramatic speeches, no confrontation, just facts, context, and dignity. As I walked back to my car, the sky was fading into a soft dusk, the kind that lets you see details more clearly before darkness settles. I wasn't sure how this fight would unfold. But that was the moment I stopped waiting for proof and started preparing for impact. Once you prepare for impact, you stop hoping the ground will be soft. The following Monday began like every other workday since I'd pushed back at that meeting. Early coffee, quiet elevator, right up to the executive floor, head down and focused on what I could control. I was still working from a reduced set of permissions, but I learned to move around that, to plan around it. I never expected calm. I just expected order. What I got was neither. By mid-morning, things were already fraying. A supplier delay pinged across my inbox, not unusual in isolation, but odd given the timing. Then a compliance sheet popped up flagged for missing confirmations. It was small, innocuous, something that could easily happen in a department juggling a dozen moving parts. But I saw the pattern. A report tagged with missing approvals, a contract left unsigned, a graph left out of a forecast. These weren't mistakes. They were the beginning of a chain reaction, and it started to feel very deliberate. I knew how to stop it. I'd walked this floor, solved these puzzles, corrected these missteps more times than most in that building. So I drafted an internal alert, outlining the irregularities and proposing mitigations. My fingers hovered above the send key longer than I'd like to admit. Not because I didn't care, quite the opposite, because I knew what would happen the moment I pressed that button. If I intervened, they'd say I caused the problem by meddling. If I remained silent, they'd claim I failed to act when it mattered. Either way, the fault would land squarely on me. It wasn't about doing what was right anymore. It was about who would be blamed for it. I erased the draft and stared at the blank email field. The silence around me, not the absence of sound, but the absence of acknowledgement, pressed in. This didn't feel accidental. It felt scheduled. My phone buzzed then, a simple message from one of the executives who seldom spoke to me directly. Let's see how it plays out. No signature, no context, just those 6 words. That was the moment everything became clear. They weren't just expecting failure. They'd set conditions where failure was the most likely outcome, and they intended to watch it unfold. By early afternoon, the failure was public. The missed deadline made it into the company newsletter with a sanitized headline, Operational Adjustments and Forward Outlook. Beneath the sterile title, the reality was more volatile. Regulatory concern from a partner, a missed compliance requirement that now needed explanation, and a vendor pulling back timelines. It was enough to trigger an emergency operations meeting. I wasn't in the first one called. I wasn't in the second. By the time someone mentioned my name, it was in passing, as if my presence or absence had nothing to do with the fact that the files were mine, the analysis came from me, and the anomalies I'd flagged were ballooning into a full-blown discussion. I watched from the periphery as decisions were drafted on my behalf. Statements were formed without consulting me. Assumptions were made about my involvement without asking a single clarifying question. That's when I understood exactly why they brought me in. This was the moment they had been preparing for all along. They needed someone to carry the weight, to be the face of a narrative that would calm anxieties elsewhere. They needed a name attached, and somehow that name became mine. By mid-afternoon, I needed air. I slipped out of the meeting room and down the corridor, out the side doors, and into the parking garage. The space was nearly empty, echoing with the distant hum of cars and footsteps. I slid behind the wheel of my car, hands still on the steering wheel, heart caught in that strange spot between shock and exhaustion. I didn't think of fleeing. Not really. It was worse than that. I thought about quitting with a kind of practical resignation that felt empty, not dramatic, just final. I rested my forehead against the cool glass of the windshield. For a moment, I just sat there, listening to the small creaks of the building settling around me. That's when my fingers brushed the old icon in my pocket. The one I'd tucked there almost on a whim after meeting the man on the street. I didn't look at it. I didn't need to. The memory of his voice was enough. Slowly, I exhaled and sat up straighter. I would not explain myself anymore in half measures or quiet apologies. If they wanted a record they couldn't rewrite, I would build it for them, piece by piece, fact by fact. I began formulating what I needed: timelines, access logs, version histories, every trace that could show exactly how this day came to be. Quietly, methodically, without emotion, because anger and sorrow had long since left the room. If they wanted a record, I would give them one they couldn't rewrite. They thought the damage would end me. What it did was teach me where the truth was buried. Once you know where the truth is buried, you stop digging randomly. The phone rang early, before the sun had fully warmed the panes of glass facing the city. I took it without hesitation. There was no caller ID, just a clipped tone and a directive. Governance session in 30 minutes. Boardroom. No explanation, no preamble. Legal counsel and HR would be present, according to the calendar invite that appeared moments later. The language was neutral but rehearsed, the kind that makes you aware you're already part of the script. When I arrived, the board-level meeting room was already filled with faces that felt too familiar and too distant at the same time. They weren't colleagues anymore. They were officials in a proceeding that had nothing to do with collaboration and everything to do with conclusion. I took a seat at the long table, deliberately centered this time, because retreating felt like ceding ground I didn't intend to give away. Strangers to most viewers might have found the room orderly, law books at one end, HR documentation at the other, water glasses arranged just so. But to me it felt like a tribunal disguised as a strategy session. A prepared summary was distributed without comment. It was read aloud by the head counsel with a calmness that belied its impact. An oversight led to a compliance issue. Judgment has been deemed inadequate. Individual responsibility lies with David Carlisle. The meeting summary made it sound like a mundane administrative finding. But the language was precise: oversight, poor judgment, individual responsibility. My actions were cited as the linchpin of the failure. My earlier warnings, or any context that might explain them, were omitted entirely. Silence filled the room when the last sentence was spoken. Not the empty silence of nothingness, but the cold quiet that hovers when people are waiting to see who will break first. I looked at the council, then at the faces of the executives who had once called me son, colleague, heir to the family legacy. Now they looked at me like a file they'd finished reviewing. They weren't asking if the narrative was true. They were asking if anyone would object. I spoke only once in measured tones that betrayed none of the tension I felt. I acknowledge responsibility, I said. But before this is finalized, can we confirm the full timeline of events and documentation involved? My question wasn't an accusation. It wasn't a plea. It was a prompt for evidence. That unsettled them, because it suggested such documentation existed, and it did. Quietly, methodically, I had begun to collect the threads of this farce long before. A private recess was called moments later. My father stood in the corridor with that same composed look he always carried, the one that made it seem like nothing ever touched him. This time, though, his eyes betrayed something different. He'd chosen his words carefully. "Accept this quietly," he said. "Walk away with dignity. The family will take care of you." It sounded generous at first, a lifeline even. But it wasn't mercy. It was containment. He believed that a quiet acceptance would fold the matter into the family narrative, like smoothing a wrinkle in a suit before presenting it to guests. I understood then that he saw this as the last conversation necessary, a soft end to a hard story. But I felt only one thing in response: clarity. If I accepted this narrative, the truth would vanish. Not just for me, but for anyone who might follow in my footsteps, hoping for fairness, integrity, or even a modicum of respect. I thought of the junior employee I helped, confused and misassigned. I thought of the worn icon the old man once held out on the curb. I thought of how many times silence had been demanded of me under the guise of harmony. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about ending the pattern. I agreed to reconvene later that day. No threats, no raised voices. A simple acknowledgement that the discussion wasn't over, even if they believed it was. I walked out of that corridor with measured steps. The light in the hallway was steady, unremarkable, yet somehow more vivid than before. The air smelled of polished floors and lingering authority. This would be the last chance they had to stop what was coming, and they wouldn't take it. The truth doesn't arrive loudly. It waits until everyone is sure they've already won. The sun had started to dip when I walked back into the boardroom. Same table, same faces. The same illusion of order that had carried them through 100 decisions. But this time, I wasn't walking in uncertain. I knew what I was bringing with me, and what I was ready to leave behind. The tone in the room was one of quiet finality. Legal counsel had returned. HR again at the margins, not speaking unless required. My father sat at the head of the table, flanked by executives whose confidence was visible in the relaxed angles of their bodies. A thick folder sat in front of each of them, clipped with a printed summary. I was invited to speak, if I had anything to offer before we proceed. They weren't expecting input. They were offering a ritual moment, something they could point to later and say, "He had his chance." I nodded once and spoke clearly. "I've read the documentation. I understand the conclusion you've prepared. I don't dispute the facts as they're outlined. Dates, roles, responsibilities." I watched a few of them exchange glances. They were surprised, maybe even relieved. But I wasn't finished. "I would just like to add one item to the official record." There was a pause, then a silent nod from legal. I placed a small USB drive on the table and pushed it forward. It includes access logs, version histories, and time-stamped internal approvals. Nothing more, nothing less. That changed the temperature in the room. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I didn't editorialize. I submitted sequence. One of the assistants plugged the drive into the conference monitor. I guided them through a series of logs and approval chains. Each screen told a story, not of my opinions, but of decisions made, permissions revoked, alerts issued and ignored. I pointed out a key file timestamped 2 weeks before the failure. It contained an internal risk flag. Submitted by me. Ignored. Then a second. A permissions change log showing I'd been locked out of the final submission process. Not because I opted out, because access had been removed. The room didn't speak. I let silence do what it does best. Fill the space with questions no one wanted to ask aloud. Then legal counsel tried to salvage the narrative. We recognize that operational failures are often systemic, he said carefully. There may be an opportunity to consider shared accountability across departments. I didn't flinch. Shared responsibility, I replied, requires shared access. That was the moment the room stopped pretending, because the access logs were already visible. There was no room left for ambiguity, no plausible deniability. The mic had dropped, but politely. I turned slightly toward my father. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. I saw what replaced certainty in his eyes, calculation breaking down. This wasn't just inconvenient anymore. This was uncontrollable. The record would stand, and that meant containment was no longer an option. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. There was no rising swell of emotion, just something quieter. Separation. The version of me that used to seek his approval, his recognition, his legacy, had already been peeled away in the weeks before. Now what remained was someone who understood the cost of clarity. As the meeting moved toward its dry procedural wrap-up, legal steps to amend the report, conversations about internal reviews, I pulled a small item from my pocket and placed it gently on the table. It was the icon, the one I'd kept. No one asked what it meant. They didn't have to. I said softly but firmly, "This was never about luck." No reply. They understood it wasn't a statement for them. It was a marker. Something for the record. The real one, not the one they'd tried to write. Papers were signed. Not by me, not yet. But the gears had shifted. They knew it. No apology was offered. None was needed. The facts had already done the work. As I walked out, the hallway was quiet. Not like the stillness of defeat, but the kind of quiet that follows something irreversible, like a bell rung that no one can unring. I didn't walk out a winner. I walked out free. Freedom doesn't feel like celebration. It feels like silence you finally chose. Several weeks had passed. The headlines had long moved on to fresher scandals. There were no reporters at my door. No reporters ever came, actually. There were no late-night calls from legal teams or family members wanting to clarify the real story. Just silence. The type of silence that didn't hum with tension anymore. Just space. Clean, blank space. I spent those first few days doing nothing extraordinary. I walked more. Cooked for myself again. Read things not tied to performance reviews. There was no announcement when the legal documents were finalized. They simply arrived in a manila envelope, slid through my mail slot like any other piece of mail. Quiet, efficient. Inside, an acknowledgement that the records had been corrected, that the approvals were real, that the fault was not mine, but no apology. There wouldn't be one. And I realized something important. I didn't need it. I hadn't walked away a hero. I hadn't won. I had simply left something that was slowly erasing me. That was enough. A few days later, a message arrived from my sister. Not a call, just a line of text. "Glad it's resolved. Hope you're well." I stared at it for a long time. There was no warmth, no real inquiry, just formality. A line people send when they want to feel like they did something, without actually doing anything. A few hours later, another message came, this one from my cousin, the one who used to work under my father at the firm. Glad everything's okay. It's a shame it got that far. I didn't reply to either. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood. Silence wasn't punishment. It was confirmation. None of them had truly believed I could walk away, and now that I had, they didn't know what to say. They had no template for this. I hadn't played my part. I hadn't begged for re-entry or tried to prove I still belonged. I hadn't lost them. I had lost the version of myself that kept asking to be let in. I sat one morning in a small cafe at the corner of the neighborhood I'd moved to, far from corporate towers and committee rooms, the kind of place where the barista remembered your name by the third visit, and no one cared what your last title was. The light was gentle, streaming across the street slowly, like it had nowhere to be. Across the room, I saw someone I hadn't expected, the junior employee, the one who'd once quietly asked for help. They approached my table, hesitant at first, then simply said, "I wanted to thank you." No speech, no drama, just those 5 words. I nodded. "You're still there?" They shrugged. "For now, but it's different. People noticed. I think that matters." And I realized it did. That moment, quiet as it was, mattered more than any report. Later that week, I walked past the corner where the old man used to sit. His chair was gone. The bench looked almost too clean. I didn't ask where he'd gone. I just stood there for a moment, then reached into my coat pocket. The icon, the one I'd carried all this time, was still there, cool against my skin, not heavy, but present. Without hesitation, I placed it gently on the bench, not tucked away, not buried, just there, where anyone could see it, or not. It wasn't an offering, or a symbol of faith. It was a release. Some things you carry because you need to, and some things you leave behind because you no longer have to. That night, I sat by my window and let the day fade without checking the time. No alerts, no unread messages. Just the sound of the world continuing. A world that no longer required me to prove anything. I thought about my father, the way he looked across that table, realizing for the first time that control wasn't the same as connection. I didn't hate him. I didn't wait for him. Family, I'd come to understand, isn't defined by blood or legacy. It's defined by those who don't require your silence to love you. Some families teach you how to endure. Others teach you when to leave. And sometimes, if you're lucky, you learn both in time to start over. I didn't walk away to be forgiven. I walked away so I wouldn't have to forgive myself for staying.